It starts with a simple illusion, that the director is the unquestioned author of a film. But in the world of action cinema where budgets explode, egos collide, and release dates are immovable, control is often an illusion bought and sold in dark editing rooms. What begins as a filmmaker's vision can end up as something far stranger. A patchwork of studio mandates, marketing fears, test screening panic, and backroom decisions made by people who were never on set. And sometimes, the result is a film the director barely recognizes as their own. In the shadows of this industry lies a covert tradition, the recut, a quiet rewriting of cinema history where directors lose their grip on the story they tried to tell. Scenes vanish. Entire character arcs evaporate. Tones shift. Messages morph. A film that once carried intention becomes something else entirely, stitched together not by creativity but by corporate anxiety. Some directors fought back. Some walked away. A few even erased their names from the credits, unwilling to be associated with the version that reached audiences. These are not just edits, they are fractures. They are the secret alternate lives of movies we thought we knew. And behind each one is a battle few fans ever hear about, fights over violence, politics, pacing, and the very soul of a story. Sometimes the original cut survives in rumor. Sometimes it surfaces years later like an artifact from another timeline. And sometimes it disappears forever, leaving only speculation and the lingering question, what was the film meant to be? These are 15 action movies that were recut without the director's consent, a hidden history of sabotage, compromise, and the uneasy truth that the version you saw was never the version intended. Fact 1. The Glimmer Man, 1996. There's a moment in The Glimmer Man that feels like something is missing because it is. The film you know is only a silhouette of what director John Gray once shaped in the editing room. What audiences saw was not his cut, but a version aggressively reassembled by the studio, stripped of the very darkness that gave the story its pulse. The original film leaned heavily into psychological tension, digging into Jack Cole's violent past, a series of flashbacks that Steven Seagal had shot with unsettling intensity. Those scenes explained his monk-like demeanor, his restraint, and his sudden brutality. And then they were erased. Studio executives worried the film was too grim for mainstream audiences, especially with Seagal's declining box office momentum. So they carved away entire character arcs, removed connective scenes, and softened moments that once gave the film emotional gravity. The violence was trimmed, the pacing was tightened until the narrative barely breathed, and what remained was an almost skeletal cut action without consequence, mystery without shadow. Gray protested the changes, but the answer was final. The studio had the final cut, not the director. The darker, moodier version has never surfaced publicly. No work print leak, no alternative cut on home video, no archived commentary acknowledging its existence. Only scattered testimonies from crew members confirm how much was lost. The irony is that the sanitized version performed worse than any darker cut likely would have. By trying to make the film safe, the studio removed the very elements that might have made it memorable. What audiences saw was not a reimagining of the director's vision, but the burial of it. Fact 2. Fire Down Below, 1997. On the surface, Fire Down Below is a standard Steven Seagal eco-thriller. But beneath its glossy edits lies a film that once carried sharper teeth and a director who watched those teeth get pulled one by one. Felix Enriquez Alcala envisioned something closer to a political noir, an environmental investigation thick with tension and moral ambiguity. But his version never reached theaters. The studio feared the tone was too message-driven, too morally heavy for an action vehicle expected to succeed globally. Entire investigative subplots vanished. Interviews with poisoned locals, sequences detailing the corporate cover-up, and a set of disturbing scenes showing the environmental devastation the villain was trying to hide. These weren't side details. They were the spine of Alcala's narrative. By removing them, the studio replaced complexity with spectacle. What remained were punch-ups, shootouts, and a strangely airy tone that clashed with the gravity of the story Seagal initially signed on to deliver. Executives also cut quieter moments showing Seagal's character navigating the community's distrust, a key tension that gave his mission emotional stakes. Without these scenes, his relationships appear oddly shallow, as though stitched together from fragments of a longer conversation that never fully plays. Alcala pushed back, but the film's producers had already locked the new edit. When he screened the final version, he barely recognized it. Insiders from the production later described the recut as a softening, a flattening, and, in one case, a complete redirection toward marketability. Ironically, the final cut pleased no one, not critics, not fans, and certainly not the director. The result is a film that feels like a ghost of its own intentions. And somewhere in storage, an unseen version whispers what it might have been. Fact 3. The Punisher. 1989. If any action film deserves the title of the cut that never stood a chance, it's The Punisher, 1989. Director Mark Goldblatt crafted a version that dug deep into the tragedy of Frank Castle, an origin story textured with grief, internal conflict, and psychological unraveling. The studio, however, wanted something entirely different. A leaner, louder film built for international sales. And so, with the quiet decisiveness of a blade sliding into its sheath, they removed the film's emotional heart. The original opening, Castle's family murdered, his transformation into a vigilante forged through fire, was cut completely. Goldblatt's version spent significant time grounding Frank's trauma, letting the audience sit with his loss before plunging into the stylized violence. But the studio believed this would slow the film down, a phrase often used just before a story loses its soul. They replaced the emotional prologue with a simple verbal explanation and launched straight into action, hoping speed would compensate for depth. The deleted scenes paint a portrait of a man descending into the darkness he swore to fight, moments where Castle confronts the morality of becoming the very thing he hunts. These scenes still exist in rough work prints circulating among collectors, and even in their unfinished state, they reveal a dramatically richer film. Goldblatt has spoken candidly about the cuts, expressing that the theatrical version was not the movie I made. His director's cut, more personal, more tragic, has never been officially released, relegated instead to rumor, bootlegs, and late-night discussions between fans of lost cinema. Ironically, the version meant to be more accessible now feels incomplete, as though the missing pieces are still echoing beneath the surface. And the Frank Castle audiences met was only half of the man Goldblatt intended to reveal. Fact 4. Let's Get Harry. 1986. There are films that slip from their director's hands, and then there is Let's Get Harry, a project so heavily reshaped in the editing room that its own director chose to abandon his name. Stuart Rosenberg, known for character-driven work like Cool Hand Luke, envisioned the film as a gritty, morally conflicted rescue drama. His cut leaned into tension, fear, and the uncomfortable weight of ordinary men pushed into extraordinary violence. But that version never saw daylight. Studio executives, convinced that audiences wanted more action and less introspection, quietly dismantled the film he delivered. Entire conversations were cut, character arcs vanished, and pauses meant to show escalating doubt were replaced with brisk momentum. The studio added scenes shot by another director, scenes Rosenberg neither approved nor supervised. These additions not only changed the tone but rewrote the film's emotional grammar. Where Rosenberg crafted a slow burn about loyalty and consequence, the studio Recut turned it into something closer to a generic action adventure. Rosenberg's frustration grew as the film drifted further from his control. When he saw the final print, he asked for his name to be removed, choosing instead the infamous pseudonym Alan Smithy, the signature used by directors who reject the work released under their name. But even that request was denied until years later, leaving his real name attached to a film that no longer reflected his voice. Over time, whispers circulated about the existence of Rosenberg's original cut, longer, darker, more morally fraught. But no complete version has ever been found, and the studio has never acknowledged keeping a print. The movie credited to Rosenberg is not the one he made, only the one he was forced to accept. Fact 5. Catchfire. 1990. Few directors have disowned their films as dramatically as Dennis Hopper did with Catchfire. What began as a stylish neo-noir thriller spiraled into one of the most notorious behind-the-scenes battles of its era. Hopper, pushing for a moody, psychological tone, shot the film with long takes, uneasy silences, and a romantic tension that simmered rather than exploded. His vision was deliberate, atmospheric, and character first. But the studio had other plans carved directly into the negative. Executives demanded more conventional pacing, more clarity, and more energy. When Hopper resisted, the studio took control of the editing room. They trimmed extended performances, removed character beats, softened moments of moral ambiguity, and reassembled the film's narrative into a more commercial shape. What survived was structurally intact but emotionally hollow, a version stripped of its noir melancholy. Even the score was adjusted to brighten moments Hopper intended to leave unresolved. The breaking point came when Hopper saw the final cut. Furious at how fundamentally the film had been reshaped, he demanded that his name be removed entirely. Hollywood has a name reserved for directors in such moments of rejection: Alan Smithee. Hopper embraced the pseudonym, signaling not only disapproval but outright disavowal. Years later, his own extended cut retitled Backtrack emerged on home video. It restored many of his original scenes, though even that version wasn't fully what he shot. But it offered enough of his intent to reveal what the film could have been: stranger, moodier, and far more daring. The official release remains a compromise sewn together by committee. The version stamped Alan Smithee is not a mystery, it's a warning about what happens when a filmmaker loses the edit. Fact 6. Hard target, 1993. If there is a director whose work depends on rhythm, violence, and operatic intensity, it is John Woo. And if there is a film whose final cut tried hardest to smother those qualities, it is Hard Target. Woo's original assembly was a kinetic fever dream: longer shootouts, balletic violence, and emotional beats shaped through motion rather than dialogue. It pushed boundaries the studio never intended to cross. When executives viewed it, panic set in. Universal feared an NC-17 rating due to the film's graphic violence. Test audiences reacted strongly, some thrilled, some unsettled, but the studio chose caution over vision. They seized control of the edit, trimming the violence, reconfiguring action scenes, and muting the operatic excess that defined Woo's style. Key shots were removed, entire beats were reworked, and the pacing was tightened until Woo's trademark crescendos became abrupt interruptions rather than symphonic rises. Woo tried to negotiate, offering compromises, shorter cuts, and alternate edits. But the studio continued refining the film into something safer, something closer to American action conventions of the early 90 seconds. Insiders later revealed that multiple cuts were created Woo's, the studio's, and at least one hybrid version tested for audiences. None fully honored the emotional architecture Woo designed. Rumors persist of a true Woo cut, one that restores extended sequences and the darker, more operatic tone. Though snippets have surfaced in international releases, a complete version has never been officially released. What viewers know today is only the studio-approved echo of Woo's vision. The final cut may bear his name, but not the fire he originally set to film. Fact 7. The Expendables, 3-2-0-1-4. The Expendables 3 was supposed to be a return to form a brutal homage to the era of blood-soaked, bone-crunching action cinema. But the version that reached theaters was anything but brutal. What fans didn't know was that the film originally carried an rated edge: harsher fights, heavier emotional beats, and a violence that mirrored the careers of the icons who starred in it. Yet before release, everything changed. Executives pushed for a PG-13 rating, convinced it would open the film to a wider audience and boost ticket sales. What followed was a dismantling. Blood was digitally erased, entire shots were restructured, impacts softened, gunfights re-edited for intensity without gore, a phrase Stallone reportedly found hollow. Moments built around sacrifice and consequence were thinned out until the emotional stakes barely registered. Even the cast felt the absent scenes meant to show the weight of aging heroes confronting their own obsolescence were trimmed, leaving motivations blurry and arcs half-formed. Stallone later admitted publicly that chasing PG-13 was a mistake. His comments hinted at the fracture between filmmaker intention and studio mandates. Rumors circulated about a harder, darker assembly screened internally, a version that leaned into the franchise's identity rather than retreating from it. But that cut has never surfaced. Not on Blu-ray, not in leaks, not in anniversary editions. It is simply gone, buried beneath the commercial instincts of executives who underestimated their audience. Fans often say the third film felt different, but they seldom know why. The truth is simple. The film lost its teeth before it ever reached them. Fact 8. RoboCop, 1987. RoboCop is remembered for its savage satire and shocking violence, but even that violence was once far more extreme. Paul Verhoeven delivered a cut drenched in brutality, designed not for exploitation but for commentary. The gore was intentional, purposeful, and embedded into the film's moral architecture. But the MPAA saw only blood. The initial cut was so intense that it risked the dreaded X rating, a commercial death sentence in the late 80 seconds. And so began one of the most notorious editing battles in action film history. The execution of Murphy was longer, more agonizing, and framed with a brutality meant to mirror corporate dehumanization. ED 209's malfunction scene was nearly operatic in its excess, pushing violence into absurdity to expose the soullessness of the system that created it. Verhoeven argued constantly that the extremity was the point, that the film's satire required the audience to confront what violence looks like when stripped of cinematic polish. But argument met bureaucracy. Cut after cut was demanded. Gore shortened, shots removed, angles adjusted. Verhoeven delivered multiple versions, each one sliced thinner. It wasn't until the 11th submitted cut that the MPAA finally approved an R rating. The theatrical version, although still striking, carried only fragments of the director's original fury. Years later, the unrated director's cut finally restored much of what was lost. And when audiences saw it, a curious thing happened. The violence, in context, felt less gratuitous and more meaningful. The irony? The very brutality the MPAA feared was what made the film whole. The censored version may have been safer, but it was the uncensored one that carried its soul. Fact 9 Blade Runner 1982. Few films have lived as many lives as Blade Runner, but none of those lives were born willingly. Ridley Scott delivered a cut steeped in ambiguity, dreamlike, atmospheric, and unapologetically strange. It was a film that trusted silence, invited interpretation, and refused to explain itself. The studio found that terrifying. After troubled test screenings, executives panicked. They believed audiences needed clarity, optimism, and a protagonist who spoke his thoughts instead of wrestling with them. And so they took Scott's vision and rebuilt it into something he never intended. They added a voiceover narration Scott despised, flat, literal, a guided tour through a world meant to be discovered, not explained. They tacked on a bright, almost pastoral ending, spliced from unused footage of The Shining, turning a noir tragedy into a fairy tale escape. They trimmed scenes that leaned too heavily into dream logic, fearing they made the film confusing. And in the process, they cut out the very ambiguity that gave Blade Runner its hypnotic power. Scott fought, but the studio controlled the final cut. For years, only scraps of his version circulated, workprint screenings, whispered descriptions from insiders, and bootleg tapes passed around by die-hard fans. When the 1992 director's cut finally arrived, it restored much of his intention. But even that edition was incomplete. It wasn't until 2007's final cut that Scott truly reclaimed the film. What emerged was a revelation, darker, stranger, more faithful to the haunting future he imagined. And it proved that the studio's fixes were never repairs, only fractures carved into a masterpiece. Fact 10. The Killer, US cut, 1989. When John Woo's The Killer arrived in the United States, it wasn't the same film he sent. The original Hong Kong cut was a symphony of violence and emotion, a balletic tragedy about honor, guilt, and the cost of loyalty. But when the film reached American distributors, particularly Miramax, it entered an editing room where aesthetic nuance was often treated as a liability. The goal wasn't artistic preservation, it was accessibility. And so a masterpiece was trimmed into something flatter, safer, and undeniably lesser. The US distributors feared American audiences wouldn't embrace Woo's long emotional pauses, the stylized slow-motion rhythms, and the lingering character beats that defined Hong Kong heroic bloodshed cinema. They cut scenes that deepened the bond between the assassin Ah Jong and the detective Li Ying, scenes that gave the story its aching humanity. They shortened Woo's iconic gunplay, tightening the edits until the choreography lost its operatic flow. And the rescoring softened moments that were meant to hit with melodic violence, turning passion into noise. Woo objected, but the American cut moved forward. Fans who grew up with the US version never saw the true emotional spine of the story, never felt the gravity of Woo's mythic framing, never understood why Hong Kong audiences wept during moments that played strangely muted overseas. Only later, through imported tapes and international releases, did viewers discover what had been lost and why the US cut felt emotionally incomplete. To this day, Some American viewers have only seen the altered version, unaware that the real film exists just beyond their reach. The US cut didn't misunderstand Wu's masterpiece, it misunderstood the entire language he was speaking. Fact 11. On Deadly Ground. 1994. On Deadly Ground was Steven Seagal's attempt to step behind the camera and deliver an action film with an environmental conscience. His director's cut reportedly ran far longer, with extended sequences exploring indigenous culture, corporate corruption, and the spiritual transformation of its protagonist. But Warner Brothers didn't want a mystical eco-epic. They wanted something commercially sharp, quick, and traditional. And so began a deep reshaping of the film Seagal believed he had crafted. Executives cut nearly 30 minutes dialogue scenes, cultural exchanges, and moments that grounded the story in a specific place and people. They trimmed speeches, reduced philosophical monologues, and restructured pacing to push the narrative forward faster. The result was a film that often felt abrupt, leaping between tones that once had connective tissue. Missing scenes that built tension were replaced by accelerated action, leaving story beats that feel strangely hollow, as though the film is remembering something it can no longer articulate. Seagal later stated that he felt the studio had removed the film's soul. Reviews from the time note the odd tonal imbalance, which many blamed on Seagal's direction, but insiders reveal it was the heavy studio recut that fractured the flow. Rumors persist about a much longer, more thematically coherent assembly screened privately before the studio takeover. But that cut has never emerged, not even as a leak or special edition bonus. The final theatrical film is a hybrid. Seagal's ambition diluted by corporate caution, tension softened by boardroom decisions. It stands as a film trying to speak in two voices, only one of which was ever meant to be heard. Fact: Dos Highlander Segund, 1991, Renegade Cut Origins. Few films have been recut as radically or as desperately as Highlander 2. What began as a troubled production spiraled into a full-blown takeover when the studio, facing financial and scheduling crises, seized control while shooting was still underway. Director Russell Mulcahy found himself pushed aside, his footage reworked by producers who had little investment in narrative coherence. The result was a theatrical cut so bewildering that fans and critics alike questioned whether anyone involved actually understood the film they released. Mulcahy's intended version was darker, stranger, and crucially far more logical within the franchise's mythology. His cut explored the nature of the immortals with thematic depth, linked character arcs with emotional clarity, and structured the story with a rhythm that echoed the tragic grandeur of the first film. But when the studio intervened, entire subplots were deleted. Explanations that anchored motivation were removed. Scenes were rearranged until cause and effect no longer aligned. The famously confusing theatrical cut wasn't an accident. It was the direct result of editorial panic. Mulcahy was so furious that he reportedly left the premiere after only a few minutes. Fans, equally outraged, clamored for the director's intended vision. It took years before the Renegade cut emerged, a reconstruction using recovered footage, alternate takes, and restored sequences. It didn't just improve the film, it rescued it. The Renegade cut revealed a work that was flawed but purposeful, bold but comprehensible evidence that the director had always been aiming at something far more cohesive. Even today, the two versions stand as a testament to what happens when a film is stolen from its creator's hands. One version survived in theaters, the other survived because fans refused to let it die. Fact 13. Universal Soldier. The Return, 1999, Universal Soldier. The Return wasn't simply re-edited, it was reshaped into something almost unrecognizable from its original conception. The director, Mike Rogers, envisioned a darker continuation of Luke Devereaux's trauma, a story steeped in the psychological fallout of resurrection, memory fragmentation, and the dying humanity of a man engineered to kill. But the studio wanted adrenaline, not introspection. They feared the early assembly felt too contemplative, so they recut the film with a single mandate: more action, less thought. Entire character beats exploring Devereaux's mental instability were removed, including scenes that traced his struggle with reconditioning and the lingering ghosts of earlier battles. The studio added new inserts, quick shots, simplified transitions, and heavier emphasis on fight choreography designed to brighten the tone even as it fractured continuity. Test screenings pushed executives further, prompting them to strip away subtleties the director viewed as essential, replacing them with explosions and one-liners to appease a younger demographic. Rogers later alluded in interviews to the existence of a heavier, more emotional cut one that made the story less about spectacle and more about Devereaux's impossible search for identity. But that version never materialized publicly. What audiences saw was a film accelerated to the point of incoherence, where character arcs were reduced to outlines and themes drowned beneath the soundtrack of forced intensity. As time passed, fans wondered why the sequel felt disconnected from the melancholy brutality of the original Universal Soldier. The answer was simple but invisible. The film was edited to prioritize noise over nuance, leaving its intended emotional backbone on the cutting room floor. Fact 14. The Order, 2001. The Order might be one of the quietest casualties of studio recutting a film whose troubled edit is rarely discussed yet unmistakably felt. Directed by Sheldon Lettich and starring Jean-Claude Van Damme, the movie originally leaned deeper into mysticism, ancient lore, and the psychological unraveling of a man trapped between faith and violence. Lettich's initial assembly included sequences exploring historical conspiracies, coded texts, and a slow-building tension around the secretive religious sect that drives the plot. But the studio didn't want a mystical thriller. They wanted a conventional action piece. Executives demanded substantial restructuring. Scenes rich with symbolic imagery and character introspection were excised. Dialogues that explained motivations and emotional stakes were cut for pacing. Action scenes were moved earlier in the film, disrupting the narrative buildup. In some cases, footage was reshuffled so aggressively that scenes designed as revelations appeared before their setup. Internal memos reportedly labeled the original tone too cerebral, a criticism that signaled the beginning of its unraveling. The result was a hybrid half-spiritual puzzle, half-action routine. Van Damme's character appears driven yet strangely hollow, because many of the scenes that explained his unraveling were never shown. Lettich acknowledged years later that the film released to audiences was not the one we shot, though he never had the chance to restore his director's cut. Fans noted that the final film feels choppy, tonally inconsistent, as if missing the exact beats that would have given it coherence. What remains is an unfinished spell, a story whose magic was dimmed not by failure of imagination, but by fear of it. The Order lost its mystery long before viewers ever saw it, lost the moment its edit was taken away. Fact 15 seconds. WAT, 2003. On paper, SWAT was a sleek, grounded action film rooted in tactical realism and character-driven tension. But the version that reached theaters was not the balanced thriller its director Clark Johnson initially crafted. His early cut focused on the dynamics within the SWAT, team trust, ego clashes, tactical discipline, and the psychological weight of high-risk operations. The emotional core centered on the fractured mentorship between Hondo and Gamble, a relationship designed to unravel slowly and painfully. But the studio feared the film was too dramatic for summer audiences, and so the recutting began. The re-edit trimmed interpersonal conflicts, reducing them to quick flashes rather than arcs. Scenes showcasing the strain of constant training, the friction between command and street-level officers, and the moral debate surrounding the team's mission were shortened or removed. Johnson's intent to show that tactical precision comes at the cost of emotional pressure was softened into something more conventional. Even the pacing of action scenes was altered, shifting the tone from tense procedural realism to broader spectacle. Reports from post-production indicate Johnson fought to keep several key moments intact, but the studio pushed for a version with broader appeal. They removed subtleties that would have clarified motivations, choosing clarity over complexity, simplicity over nuance. Critics later remarked that the film felt like two movies spliced together, a comment unintentionally revealing, one film Johnson made, and one the studio insisted on shaping. The theatrical cut works as entertainment, but lacks the psychological layering its director intended. And buried somewhere in the archives is a version where every bullet, every stare, every silence meant far more than what survived. Bonus fact: the cut you'll never see. There's a rumor whispered in post-production circles, a myth that drifts from editing bay to editing bay. Somewhere, buried in studio vaults, lies a forgotten assembly of an action film no one has ever seen. No title is confirmed, no director is named. Only fragments exist, stories told by former assistants, editors who signed NDAs decades ago, and technicians who swear they handled reels that didn't match the final release. They speak of a version far darker than the film that reached theaters, a cut filled with character beats that were too honest, violence that was too raw, and truths that executives feared would make the story unmarketable. Some say the director walked away after losing the edit, refusing to attach their name to what remained. Others claim the cut was screened once, in a room of 6 people, and shelved before anyone outside that room knew it existed. A few insist the footage is gone entirely misplaced, mislabeled, or quietly destroyed. But there are those who believe it still sits in a cold vault, sealed in containers marked only with production numbers, waiting for someone curious enough or reckless enough to open them. What haunts people isn't the film itself, but what it represents. The idea that entire versions of stories can vanish without a trace, not because they were failures, but because they were inconvenient. A reminder that behind every movie we think we know lies another one, born from conflict, compromise, and choices the audience never sees. And somewhere, out there, one of those lost cuts might still be intact. The question is simple. If it surfaced tomorrow, would it change everything we thought we knew? If you've made it this far, you already know that every film hides a second story, one told in editing rooms, studio offices, and the quiet spaces where creative battles leave their scars. Tell us in the comments which fact reshaped the way you see these movies, and which director's lost cut you believe deserves to surface next. And as always, if you want us to dig deeper into the unseen corners of action cinema, subscribe for more. Which version of a film do you think the world was never meant to see?